Here at Jones Day Talks, we try to bring you access to accomplished, interesting lawyers discussing significant and trending legal topics. This program certainly meets that standard. You're about to hear Jones Day's Ted Chung, who leads the firm's global investigations and white-collar practice, talk with Veronica Dragalin. Veronica recently joined Jones Day after a public sector career that included an assistant AG position in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles and, moving way across the map, serving as chief of the Anti-corruption Prosecution Office for the Republic of Moldova. They'll talk about trends in cross-border investigations, working with international agencies like Interpol and Europol, and what multinational corporates should be on the lookout for in terms of enforcement actions. Stay here. This should be good. I'm Dave Dalton. You're listening to Jones Day Talks.
I'm Ted Chung. I'm a partner at Jones Day, resident in the firm's Chicago office. I chair the firm's investigations and white-collar defense practice. We have a global practice, and one of the best things about our practice is the opportunity to work closely with so many accomplished lawyers who have deep experience in investigations, enforcement, and compliance matters in locations throughout the world. My new partner in Washington, D.C., Veronica Dragalin, is a good case in point in terms of being able to bring to the table perspectives that cut across multiple jurisdictions. She's really quite unique for reasons that we'll discuss in this podcast. So, Veronica, thank you for joining us today and welcome back to Jones Day. We'll get into your legal career in a bit, but can you first tell us a little bit about your personal background?
Thanks, Ted. And I'm very excited to be back at Jones Day and to have been invited on this podcast. A little bit about my personal background before we get into the career. I was born in the mid-'80s in the Soviet Union in what is now the Republic of Moldova. I grew up speaking Romanian at home with my parents. And in the early 90s, when things were quite bad economically in that part of the world, my parents had an opportunity to move abroad. And so we lived in Italy for a year and Germany for 2 years, and then we immigrated to the United States. So I was in 5th grade at the time I got to the U.S. I didn't speak any English, but learned it soon enough and was essentially educated and grew up here in the U.S., but maintained ties with our extended family back in Moldova. And obviously, that's sort of my home country. But I was lucky enough to have had quite an interesting childhood and upbringing in all these different places.
And then you ended up going to law school in the United States. Is that right?
That's right. So I got my undergrad degree and as well as my law school education here in the U.S. I went to the University of Virginia School of Law.
And then after law school, Veronica, your first legal job was with Jones Day. Is that right?
That's right. So as many law students do, I went through the on-campus interview process and I had a summer internship at Jones Day, actually the Dallas office. So I spent a summer in Dallas working there and then decided after law school to move to the West Coast, to California. So I actually began my career as a Jones Day associate in the Los Angeles office back in 2011. And I got to work on some really interesting cases while I was there as a young associate and getting to know the lay of the land of what it's like to work at a big law firm.
Hey, what was the general nature of your practice as an associate in the Los Angeles office of Jones Day?
So officially, I joined the Business and Tort Litigation Group. So I was doing a decent amount of big litigation matters, things like products liability, various corporate disputes, and things like that, which I found interesting. A lot of them based in California. I also, like many other associates that I knew, were quite interested in the white-collar world because those seemed like really interesting investigations and cases. And so I was lucky enough to have an opportunity to work with some of the partners that were in that group and got to do some, what I thought at the time and continue to think were maybe some of the most interesting cases I worked on because they brought me to places like Switzerland and Colombia in South America and Hong Kong, Shanghai. So I really felt like I got to go around the world and get to work and get to know these businesses and clients that we worked for in these different regions and different industries, all confronting various types of legal issues, criminal investigations by Department of Justice, tax investigations, allegations of trade secret theft. So a lot of variety. It was really, really fascinating and interesting work.
Well, I shouldn't be surprised then that you then went off after being an associate at Jones Day for a number of years to become an assistant U.S. attorney in the Los Angeles U.S. Attorney's Office. As you reflect back on that part of your career, being a federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice, what stands out to you?
In some ways, my work, my exposure to that type of work and those great lawyers at Jones Day is what led me to then go to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Many of the partners that I worked with were themselves former AUSAs and had really great stories about their times being a prosecutor. The other reason I decided to become a prosecutor, and I eventually became sort of specialized, I joined the public corruption and civil rights section at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, was my background, childhood sort of experiences growing up in Moldova and facing and seeing firsthand endemic corruption. So, for example, my family being asked for bribes when we were coming into the country with suitcases full of presents for our families. Like that was just par for the course for Moldova. Or if someone got pulled over, the police officer asking for a bribe. That was just the normal world in the early 90s and 2000s in Moldova. And so being here in the US, especially having the experience of having gone to law school, working at a law firm, it really made me respect sort of the justice system and what it means to really fight for that and to represent victims of crime and to represent the United States on things like fighting corruption, where the victim is society at large. So I became a prosecutor specialized in those types of cases and got to do really interesting corruption work as well as civil rights cases. Probably my most notable one that's become public because many of the pieces of that investigation have gone to trial and sentencing and appeals already by now, was a big pay-to-play scheme in Los Angeles wherein development construction companies were paying bribes to Los Angeles City Council members to get permits and authorizations to build giant skyscrapers in LA. And they were doing this through a whole network of facilitators, as you will, which we see in many other countries in terms of expediters, that type of terminology. And we at the Department of Justice and during that time period actually charged that entire case as a RICO conspiracy, which is relatively rare in the white collar world. So it was very fascinating to get to work on that case for many years. It took a lot of time to build it. I had experience doing wire interceptions and various other interesting law enforcement tools that, again, don't always apply in the white collar world, but I got to use them. And so it was a fascinating experience. I was very proud of the results that the team got in that particular investigation. That was probably the longest one that I worked on, but I got exposure to all sorts of different cases while I was a prosecutor and a lot of courtroom experience, which was part of why I wanted to have that experience. I had 10 jury trials and opportunities to argue before the Ninth Circuit as well. So it was really, really nice to have the stand-up experience, which I think you only get better by doing it yourself, as well as watching others that you really respect do it well as well.
And how many years did you spend at the LA U.S. Attorney's Office?
I was there for 6 years. So I was in LA for 5 years at Jones Day and then 6 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
So, Veronica, I was an AUSA myself, although I was in Chicago. And so I'm very familiar with that career, that type of legal job. Many DOJ lawyers will make it a career. They'll stay in the department throughout the entire career. Others will leave to become judges, or they'll go teach or pursue opportunities in the private sector, or sometimes take jobs in other parts of the government in the United States. Now, you did something different, maybe unprecedented. You went off and became a very high level, in fact, the top level chief anti-corruption prosecutor for an entirely different country, in this case, Moldova. You might be the only person who has ever held such high-level criminal enforcement positions in multiple countries. At least I'm not aware of anybody who has that background. How did you go from being an AUSA in Los Angeles, a U.S. barred lawyer, to becoming the chief anti-corruption prosecution enforcer for the Republic of Moldova?
Yeah, somewhat unusual career path, perhaps. But as I mentioned, I'm originally from Moldova. That's where I was born, and I have quite vivid memories of that. I went to first grade in Moldova and then spent all my summers in my childhood in my grandparents' villages with my little sister. So I had close ties to that country. And back in 2021, there was a big sort of hopeful wave in Moldova in that a pro-Western party came to power. They won the vote majority in parliament. And their entire platform, I mean, what they really campaigned on was anti-corruption and justice reform. So people were very excited on the ground in Moldova, and it felt like it was a majority of people given the vote results. So it was really quite contagious in some ways. There were a lot of people, I wasn't the only one, that were Moldovan citizens that were living abroad, some of them for decades living abroad, that were inspired to want to come back to Moldova to really contribute to this new effort of justice and anti-corruption with the eye towards joining the European Union, which is just such a major goal for Moldova. And it seemed like all the things were aligned to allow that to happen. So the position of chief prosecutor was open. It was a little bit dramatic. It was open because my predecessor had been arrested himself. So, a little bit of a traumatic experience for, I would say, the prosecutors in that office. But there was an entire competition for people to apply for that position. And I decided to apply. It was an interesting timing. I had bought a plane ticket to participate in the interview process in person, which was supposed to be on March 5th. My plane ticket was for March 5th, 2022. And as you know, Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2024, so just a few days prior. So my flights were canceled and the whole process got a little bit delayed. I ended up having to do the interview by Zoom in Romanian, which was a little bit intimidating, even though it was my native language. I felt like the vocabulary of an 8-year-old as opposed to a professional, but I brushed up on it and prepared. And ultimately, after a couple of rounds of these very public interviews, I was selected the winner of that competition. And I moved to Moldova in August 2022 to begin what was supposed to be my 5-year mandate in that position.
Yeah, one thing I found really interesting was that Zoom interview, if I got the right interview in mind, Veronica, was actually recorded and then publicly available. So I actually looked at it. You look quite impressive, although I didn't understand a word of what you said, but you obviously impressed the panel there. Let's talk about your office in Moldova, the office that you inherited, became the chief of once you started your tenure there. Yeah, can you tell us about the size, the organization, the priorities of the office as you stepped into the role?
Sure. And so corruption obviously is a big problem around the world, but in Moldova in particular, it really is such an endemic problem. The political party came to power campaigning on anti-corruption. So the role of the Anti-corruption Prosecution Office, so this specialized prosecution office for the country, was extremely important. It was quite small and did not have very many resources, as most of these agencies go all around the world. So in total, it was about 150 people, and that included about 50 prosecutors, as well as officers, so law enforcement agents that were seconded to the prosecution office. They were kind of embedded within the office and reported to me directly, as well as paralegals, support staff, and others. So a big group of people to walk into, a little bit intimidating. I was wondering whether being a woman and relatively young, what that would be like in terms of sort of being the head of a quasi-law enforcement agency and a prosecution office. But when I got there on the ground, one of the things that surprised me was actually how young the whole office was. So it almost seems like it's a new generation of people that have decided to stay in Moldova and instead of emigrating to other countries for better opportunities. So in that regard, it's almost hopeful that maybe there's a new generation, people younger than me that are there and dedicated to want to contribute to this effort. So I was quite impressed with my colleagues that were part of my team in terms of how well prepared they were and everything else. We had really high profile matters. I would say I don't think any other prosecution office had anything else that was every day on the news. We had a lot of historic cases that the society was waiting for answers on, some major bank fraud scandals that had happened back in 2014, so almost a decade ago. And our priorities were that every, I think, anti-corruption agency around the world. We always hear the phrase that we need to take the profit out of crime. And so focusing on confiscating assets of ill-gotten gains and the oligarchs and former oligarchs. So that was a big priority, as well as going after high-level officials. So there's a big difference between a police officer accepting a $20 bribe to let a ticket go versus a prime minister engaging in corruption. So the office that I began to lead in August 2022 had open investigations against former presidents, prime minister, head of the Supreme Court, prosecutor general. Like it was like the highest levels of Moldovan government from prior administrations basically had active cases. So there was a lot of pressure to give results. And that's what we were focused on, as well as obviously maintaining an active enforcement role in current situations, happenings in the country in terms of public procurement and various other things.
Yeah, I found it fascinating when you described to me a few weeks ago how not only were you thinking about creating new priorities and different focuses of your investigative work within the country, but you were so actively working with counterparts really across the region and sometimes outside the region, and how big a part of your day-to-day job that was to be in that kind of coordination. Could you describe that for the folks listening in? What was that really like to be coordinating with law enforcement authorities across Europe and sometimes outside Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. On some level, I anticipated that this job would involve some international cooperation, but I don't think I appreciated just how much that would really be part of my day-to-day dealings and the office's work in general. Now, looking back on it, it actually makes perfect sense. So Moldova is a very tiny country, doesn't have a very developed financial sector, etc. So almost everyone opens bank accounts in other countries, be it sort of the newer, more popular jurisdictions like the UAE. We also had a lot of kind of historic bank accounts in Latvia and Lithuania and the Baltic states, in addition to the general ones we're used to, which is the Switzerland, the UK, France, etc. And so definitely the financial flows almost always touched other jurisdictions. We also had a lot of oligarchs in Moldova, people that got very wealthy through their positions of power in Moldova that had really great taste. So they bought villas in France and chalet in the Swiss Alps and then sent their children to boarding school in the United Kingdom. So our investigations all involved having to get records from these various jurisdictions. And as I mentioned, my predecessor had been himself arrested for corruption. So I think it's fair to say that the credibility of Moldova, and in particular the Anti-corruption Prosecution Office, vis-a-vis the law enforcement partners in other countries, was quite broken when I stepped in. A lot of the people that had maybe interfaced with his prior chief and had worked on some of these investigations felt quite burned by that experience. And so I felt like picking up from scratch and having to repair some of those relationships. I think it helped that I was essentially someone new, someone trained as a federal American prosecutor. That helped a lot in terms of the credibility. My ability to speak English fluently, I think, helped a lot as well. A lot of my colleagues did not speak English. And so being able to have Zoom calls and just look, face to face, talk to some Swiss prosecutors in English, or getting to meet on the sidelines of various international conferences, the prosecutors from France and the UK and Israel and UAE. I was doing so much of that. And in my experience, the relationship, the personal aspect of really getting to meet people, to make them understand how important this particular case is to your country, right? To them, it's just an additional sort of subpoena or search warrant that they have to deal with. But being able to really tell them that the personal element of Moldova's story and how important that particular case is for our country and what we were trying to do, that's what really got the ball moving. And the office succeeded in identifying and freezing really high valued assets in some of these countries. So for example, a 26 million euro villa in Switzerland, we succeeded in freezing, and many, many others. So it was really fascinating to get to know how the law enforcement agencies and prosecution offices in these other countries work, to be able to use as a tool some of the international things like Europol and Eurojust, some of the channels or structures for international cooperation. I got to learn which of those channels are faster than others, things like that. So it was really great to get exposure to that aspect of international collaboration and sharing of evidence and information. How exactly does it happen? Who do you contact in the various countries? It was really helpful to get to see that firsthand. And I hope that in my work here at Jones Day, I can offer that type of insight, that type of real life experience, not just sort of theoretically knowing how it works, but being able to articulate and explain to a client what that means and how quickly the law enforcement agencies on the other side might be able to talk to each other or react. I hope that that's a helpful perspective that I can bring to some of the cross-border matters that Jones Day handles.
We'll have to do a whole separate podcast at some point, Veronica, maybe some technical aspects of cross-border information sharing on the law enforcement side. I'm very curious to hear about how much of that's informal, how much of it's very structured, how much of it's treaty, how much of it's non-agreement based, et cetera, and how much of it might be visible to targets or subjects of investigations, whether or not they are aware at the time of the fact that there is an ongoing investigation. So we'll treat that subject another day, but I appreciate that. So you're obviously in your own personal experience from the United States, and then over to Moldova, and then within Moldova, working with so many different jurisdictions, you've got a really good perspective on different legal frameworks, different legal regimes, and similarities, maybe the differences. From the standpoint of a corporate entity or a corporate executive, you could be U.S. based, you could be non-U.S. based, but you're multinational. What are some of the things that really stick out to you in terms of trying to understand and if necessary, mediate and reconcile differences across jurisdictions when it comes to enforcement activity, enforcement principles, enforcement authority? Continue from that perspective.
Yeah, I think there were two that stood out. And I knew in advance that they were different from the United States. And then being on the ground there in Moldova, I really saw how that really impacted our day-to-day decision-making within the office. And I think the same applies to other jurisdictions. So the first is Moldova, like many of the European countries that follow sort of a civil law regime, unlike the American British system, it is a compulsory prosecution regime, which means if there is a credible complaint, which is a very, very low threshold, but if certain elements are just met just in the complaint itself, the prosecutor or the law enforcement agency, in Moldova, both can take complaints, is obligated to open an investigation. In Moldova, for example, you then have 45 days to decide whether to open an actual criminal investigation, which gets much more serious after that. You have tools within this 45 day. You have sort of what would be equivalent to like subpoena power and things of that sort. So the fact that you're not off the bat kind of saying you're not passing on anything based on just prosecutorial discretion and resources, what you want, setting priorities by new administrations, that doesn't exist. It's just everything must be opened. From the perspective of our clients, for example, you have a competitor that's not happy about the result of a particular procurement and who won the bid. If they make some type of almost baseless allegation that there was corruption involved in that bid, it's very likely that at least some type of inquiry will be opened because the prosecutor almost has no choice. And so that does lead to a lot more frivolous criminal process like that. In Moldova, unfortunately, for many years, this was used as ways for businesses to sort of hurt each other, in kind of the competition world. And as prosecutors, that made our jobs very difficult because you didn't know, is this actually legitimate? Or is this business just trying to use our resources, the public resources, to, shake down their competitor on something? So that's something to keep in mind and something to be really mindful of in those jurisdictions that function that way, which is just very, very different from the United States. The second almost goes hand in hand with that, because the other thing that I was very surprised by learning about most European jurisdictions is there really is a lack of a mechanism to negotiate a resolution. So once a criminal investigation has been started, in many jurisdictions in Europe, there are no deferred prosecution agreements or non-prosecution agreements. There are some hopeful exceptions. So France is one such example where there are such agreements that can be negotiated that are similar to the US NPA and DPA. Moldova, actually, while I was there, I lobbied very hard to introduce that concept into the Moldovan code, which we succeeded in doing. So now in Moldova, that is also a mechanism available to corporations in particular, or companies and particular business entities, to be able to resolve their cases. But in general, most cases in Moldova that we handled went to trial instead of being resolved through plea negotiations, which again is very, very different from the US world. And so that's something to keep in mind for clients that have business in these jurisdictions, because you might not be able to necessarily resolve the issue in a more predictable way that you would in the United States. So very big differences that I do think made the day-to-day work of a prosecutor different and would make an in-house counsel have to think about and weigh those things as well.
Sure. Particularly if you're trying to deal with something that is cross-border with cross-border legal implications and trying to strategize about coming up with something that looks like a global resolution. And you've got different means of doing so across different jurisdictions. It just adds to the complexity. So you're back in the United States, or you're in a Washington office. You're no longer in Moldova. What caused you to leave Moldova?
Yeah. So I left a little bit before my 5-year mandate. I was supposed to be there until 2027. This was something that I anticipated in advance. I wasn't necessarily naive about it, that the head of an anti-corruption agency may have some friction with politicians and people in power. I think that's very common around the world, right? If the anti-corruption agencies start asking questions or looking too closely at something in particular, perhaps the politicians would not like that and even be vocal about it. I think that's fair. That's to be expected. So that started happening in Moldova after some time that I was there. It was happening behind closed doors as well. So not just sort of public commentary, but there were more and more examples of me being asked to do certain things that I absolutely drew a very red line and said that I would absolutely not authorize something like that. I would absolutely not put anyone in my office in the position to authorize something like that were very popular, right? That's not the answer that sometimes politicians want to hear. And what I'm talking about in particular is something like executing a search warrant at a particular opponent's office when I was trying to explain there is not enough probable cause to do that. We cannot go over the line on something like that. And then conversely, opening an inquiry or investigation into certain things, which, as I explained, are almost not within our discretion, right? If we get a complaint that meets all of the elements, we have to open an investigation. If the person or company did nothing wrong, we will close it, but we have to go through the process. Again, not very popular sometimes with politicians when it involved people within, their sphere. So over time, we had more and more friction, I would say. Eventually, almost a year ago after the presidential elections, it escalated a little bit more quickly. The president ordered my security detail to be pulled. That made me feel a little bit vulnerable to no longer have that protection in the country, for which I had a very visible position. And then over time, a few months later, the president herself asked for my resignation. I refused in our conversation because I believed that I was doing the right things in my position as the chief of the Anti-corruption Prosecution Office. I felt it was correct to be vocal about the resources this office continued to need and everything else. And unfortunately, a couple of weeks after that, Parliament voted a law to dismantle the Anti-corruption Prosecution Office, which would have, by effect, gotten rid of me as the head of that office. Once it escalated to that level, I decided to resign from the post because I felt that probably would make everything else stop. I didn't want my colleagues to be in jeopardy of losing their jobs. I didn't want our investigations to all of a sudden be up in the air if the office was dismantled. And so I ended up resigning. And I'm happy to say that, we're 6 months later and they did not dismantle the office. So hopefully it had the intended result of keeping the office running. And my former colleagues are still there on the ground doing the work we used to work on together. I'm following from afar their press releases and their news and hope that they continue to do a decent job in what's really difficult, complicated circumstances.
When I first heard about your security detail getting pulled, I hoped that wasn't true, but unfortunately, it did in fact happen. And then on top of it, I heard from you directly, Veronica, about how public your role was. Like in the United States, prosecutors are often, before the cameras, making public statements for different reasons. It seems to me like your role in Moldova as the chief anti-corruption prosecutor there was even more visible and almost on a day-to-day basis. Could you describe that?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, I think, the office itself had so many of these ongoing investigations, like, for example, of a former president, the president that had just been the president the term before. So not even a really, super historic situation. So rightfully so, the public interest in what the office was doing and the decisions that the office were making was extremely high. And I felt that being the chief of that office, I was the person that had the responsibility to answer those questions rather than putting it on the individual case prosecutors. I try to protect them from that as much as possible. So I was the one, going out there for press conferences, for radio interviews, TV interviews, because I did think it was really important to establish a trust with the people of Moldova so that they felt confident that the office was working in the public interest and in the citizens' interest and not just protecting vested interests and various other things, which is what the reputation of that office had been. So it was very public facing. In some ways, it's interesting to have had the position of a high level sort of public figure. It made me kind of have that hat on. And now I think I can think about what's it like on the other end of the political person or a public figure in another country. What are their disclosure obligations? I had to fill out asset disclosures that I had to file. So I myself have gone through that. So I think, again, thinking about what our clients may be facing, some of our the companies that are doing business and interacting with these public officials in other countries, having been one myself, I think hopefully that's, again, a perspective I can offer that can be somewhat unique.
Okay, last question, Veronica, but perhaps for our audience, the most important question. So you've got now experience in the private sector with Jones Day, previously at the U.S. Department of Justice and the significant European prosecutor's office. What can you tell companies and corporate executives about the current enforcement environment from a multinational perspective, in particular about the kinds of enforcement priorities that ought to influence thinking about risk and risk mitigation, both a compliance and a defense perspective for that matter? And then, again, this would apply to not just US-based companies, but really companies doing business in any of these regions across the world.
Yeah, obviously in the United States, we've had a lot of discussions over the past few months about priorities of the Department of Justice that have been stated. So, for example, a de-emphasis, I would say, on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and some speculation that perhaps that will no longer really be a big enforcement priority. That said, we did see, recent trial conviction in that world where high-level DOJ officials are still emphasizing that prosecuting corruption of foreign officials, it will continue to be a priority if it affects American business. But on top of just sort of looking at the American enforcement, we've seen a few months ago, earlier this summer, task force, sort of anti-corruption task force be announced by the UK, Swiss, and French governments. We also have the European Public Prosecutor's Office, which is a relatively new institution in Europe. It only began its work in 2021, but has consistently gotten more and more active in the field of tax fraud and various other types of crimes that affect EU financial interests. So I do think that there will be more activity from some of these other jurisdictions. The UK obviously being such a huge financial center for the world, many things touch the UK or the banking system. So the jurisdictional hook is quite small. So for companies that are doing international business that have offices in other places, including Europe, I think the compliance regime and the enforcement that is to be expected is not going away. In the US, perhaps some of the priorities are shifting to things like trade fraud or sanctions evasions. We will have some active things happening in US enforcement as well. For clients, it becomes more complicated when the world is more unpredictable. And I do think that the world is a little bit more unpredictable these days when it comes to various priorities like that, trade relations, geopolitics, and everything else. So I hope that we'll have opportunities to be able to guide our clients, to be able to advocate on their behalf if they find themselves in the crosshairs of enforcement agencies around the world. And I hope I have a chance to contribute to some of the great lawyers and teams that are here at Jones Day to offer what I can based on my perspective and my experience having worked on the ground, as you mentioned, both in U.S. law enforcement as well as Eastern European.
Well, that's a great note to end on, Veronica. And again, so great to have you back at Jones Day. I know I can speak for all of our colleagues here that we're so excited to be able to work with you going forward in service of our clients really across the globe. So thank you for your time and thank you for sharing your story and your insights.
Such a pleasure. Thanks, Ted.
Thank you very much, Ted and Veronica. I sense there's a follow-up podcast coming. For complete bios and contact information for Ted and Veronica, please visit jonesday.com. While you're there, check out our Insights page for more podcasts, plus publications, videos, newsletters, blogs, and other timely content. Subscribe to Jones Day Talks at Apple Podcasts or wherever else you find your podcast content. Jones Day Talks is produced, again, by Mr. Tom Condolis. As always, we thank you for listening. I'm Dave Dalton. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to Jones Day Talks. Comments heard on Jones Day Talks should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. The opinions expressed on Jones Day Talks are those of lawyers appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information, please visit jonesday.com.